The quantum core of the Ytharian warship Eternity's Edge fractured at precisely 14:37 station time, 3 days into what should have been a routine border patrol. The sound it made was not loud. Quantum containment failures rarely were. But every engineer within 50 meters felt it in their bones, a subtle wrongness in the ship's harmonic rhythm that spoke of disaster. Chief Engineer Kesval reached the engineering bay within 90 seconds, his elongated Ytharian frame moving with practiced efficiency through the corridors. What he saw on the diagnostic display made his secondary heart skip a beat. The quantum containment matrix, the elegant crystalline structure that held the ship's power source in perfect geometric suspension, showed a hairline fracture extending 3.2 millimeters across its surface. In 12,000 years of Ytharian spacefaring history, there had never been a successful repair of a fractured quantum core. The mathematics were absolute. Once the containment geometry was compromised, cascade failure was inevitable. It was not a matter of skill or effort. It was simply physics. Kesval walked to the captain's ready room with the bearing of a man delivering a death sentence. Captain Thel'van looked up from his tactical displays, saw the expression on his chief engineer's face, and understood immediately. "How long?" Thel'van asked. 18 hours, Kesval replied. "Perhaps 20 if we reduce power to absolute minimum, but the fracture is growing. There is no repair possible." Thel'van was 63 years old, a veteran of the Ytharian defense fleet for 40 years. He had faced death before, had lost crew members, had made the hard decisions that command required. But this was different. This was his entire crew, 140 souls dying not in battle but from simple mechanical failure in empty space. "Broadcast distress," he said quietly. "All frequencies, prepare the escape pods." The nearest military vessel was 6 days away. The nearest commercial shipping lane was 2 days in the opposite direction. They were in neutral space in the empty gap between civilizations, where traffic was rare and rescue unlikely. But protocol was protocol. They sent the signal. In the crew quarters, word spread quickly. Ytharians did not panic. Their culture valued stoic acceptance of fate, the graceful acknowledgement of circumstances beyond control. They had lived with honor. If they were to die in the void, they would do so with dignity. In the engineering bay, Kesval ran diagnostics he knew were pointless, checked systems that no longer mattered, and tried not to think about his daughter waiting for him at the orbital station above Ithara Prime. She was 16, brilliant, just accepted into the engineering academy. She would understand. The mathematics were clear. 32 minutes after the distress call, a response came through. "Eternity's Edge, this is the salvage vessel Lucky Patch. Received your distress. What's your situation?" The voice was human, female, casual, with an accent that suggested one of the outer colony worlds. Thel'van felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed. What could a human salvage operator do that his trained engineers could not? "Lucky Patch, we have suffered catastrophic quantum core failure. Fracture in the containment matrix. We are preparing to abandon ship." There was a pause, then, "Can you send me your engineering specs? I'm about 40 minutes out from your position." Thel'van glanced at Kesval, who made a small gesture of uncertainty. They had nothing to lose. The specs were transmitted. Another pause, longer this time. Thel'van imagined the salvage operator reviewing the data, seeing the impossibility of the situation, preparing to offer condolences before continuing on her way. "Okay," the voice came back. "I've seen worse. Permission to come aboard." Kesval's mouth fell open slightly. Thel'van felt an unfamiliar sensation, something between disbelief and desperate, irrational hope. "You believe you can repair this?" Thel'van asked carefully. "I believe I can try," the human replied. "Look, you've got 18 hours. That's plenty of time. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Lucky Patch out." The comm channel closed. Thel'van and Kesval stared at each other. "It is impossible," Kesval said quietly. "She does not understand." "Perhaps," Thel'van agreed. "But we have already accepted death. What harm can come from allowing her to try?" Jules Reeves had been running salvage operations in the neutral sectors for 8 years, ever since her discharge from the human merchant fleet. She was 47 years old, short by human standards at barely 5 feet 3 inches. stocky and strong from years of manual labor in variable gravity. Her ship, the Lucky Patch, was a Mackenzie-class tug that had been old when she bought it and was now held together by spare parts, improvised repairs, and what Jules liked to call aggressive optimism. She had seen the Eternity's edge on long-range sensors before the distress call came through, a Sentinel-class warship, beautiful in the way that Ytharian engineering always was, all elegant curves and perfect proportions. When the distress signal broadcast, she had been 38 minutes away and closing, close enough to help. Maybe. The engineering specs told her most of what she needed to know. Fractured quantum core, growing stress fractures, cascade failure inevitable. According to every engineering manual in the galaxy, the ship was doomed. But Jules had never been very good at accepting what manuals told her was impossible. She reviewed the specs for 15 minutes, making notes on a data pad that was cracked and repaired with, appropriately enough, a strip of clear tape. Then she went to her cargo hold and started pulling supplies. 2 large duffel bags worth, rolls of carbon-reinforced adhesive tape, cable ties in various sizes, tubes of industrial sealant, spare welding rods, a portable arc welder, rubber dampening pads, metal mesh, wire, and various other items that she had collected over years of improvised repairs. Her tools were worn but well-maintained, and she knew each one intimately. The Lucky Patch docked with the Eternity's edge with the kind of casual imprecision that made the Ytharian crew watching from the viewports wince. Jules eyeballed the connection, trusted the magnetic clamps to compensate, and powered down her approach thrusters about a second later than any manual would recommend. The 2 ships connected with a solid thunk that resonated through both hulls. Good enough, Jules muttered to herself, and started gathering her gear. When she cycled through the airlock, 3 Ytharians were waiting for her. Captain Thel'van she recognized from his uniform and bearing, tall, dignified, with the silver-blue skin and elongated features characteristic of his species. The other 2 were engineers, including one who introduced himself as Chief Engineer HFY. Jules nodded to all of them, her magnetic boots clanking on their pristine deck plating. She was wearing coveralls that had been oil-stained so many times they had achieved a kind of permanent gray-brown patina. Her hands were scarred and calloused. Next to the immaculate Ytharians in their crisp uniforms, she looked like exactly what she was, a bottom-tier salvage operator who spent more time elbow-deep in machinery than anywhere else. "Ma'am," Thel'van began, with the exquisite politeness of someone trying not to offend a person who was about to die along with his crew, "I must inform you that our engineers have determined the repair to be impossible. I do not wish for you to sacrifice yourself in a futile—" "Yeah, I read the specs," Jules interrupted, hefting her duffel bags. "Where's the core?" The walk to engineering took 5 minutes. Jules took in everything as they moved. The clean corridors, the perfect right angles, the subtle hum of systems operating in flawless synchronization. Ytharian ships were works of art, every component designed to integrate seamlessly with every other component. Beautiful, efficient, and Jules thought, fragile in ways their builders didn't quite realize. The engineering bay was a cathedral to precision. The quantum core sat in the center, suspended in a matrix of force fields and stabilizers, a crystalline structure about 2 meters in diameter that pulsed with contained power. Even from the entrance, Jules could see the fracture, a dark line across the surface that seemed to absorb light. She walked up to the safety barrier and stood there for a long moment, hands on her hips, just looking, listening, feeling the subtle vibrations through the deck plating. HFY came to stand beside her. "The fracture extends through 7 layers of the matrix," he said quietly. "The quantum field is held in perfect geometric alignment by the crystal structure. Even a deviation of 0.0001 millimeters results in cascade failure. The fracture is currently 3.2 millimeters and growing approximately 0.3 millimeters per hour. In 16 hours, it will reach critical threshold." Jules nodded slowly. "But it hasn't exploded yet." "No," HFY agreed. "The containment is holding for now." "Why?" The question seemed to confuse him. "Because the fracture has not yet reached." No, I mean, why is it holding? If it's broken, if the geometry is off, why hasn't it failed already? Kesval considered this. There is some tolerance in the system. Small deviations can be compensated for by the secondary stabilizers, but that tolerance is limited. So the secondary stabilizers are already working to compensate. Yes. And they're holding it together. For now, yes, but then we're not trying to fix the core, Jules said. We're trying to help the secondary systems do what they're already doing. We're just giving them more support. She dropped her duffel bags and started unpacking. Kesval watched in growing confusion as she pulled out rolls of silver tape, bundles of cable ties, what appeared to be sections of rubber matting. These are primitive materials, he said carefully. These are materials that work, Jules corrected. She pulled out a handheld sensor unit, human-made, battered but functional, and started taking readings around the core housing. Your secondary stabilizers are fighting each other. See, you've got harmonic resonance building up in the mounting struts. Every time the core pulses, the struts vibrate slightly, and those vibrations are feeding back into the containment field. It's making the fracture worse. Kesval pulled out his own scanner, much more sophisticated than Jules's device, and checked. She was right. The resonance was there, barely detectable but present. He had not noticed it before because he had been focused on the primary failure. Even if we eliminate the resonance, he said, the fracture itself can't be fixed, I know, Jules said. So we're not going to fix it. We're going to work around it. Over the next 6 hours, the Ytharian engineering crew watched in a mixture of horror and fascination as Jules Reeves did things that violated every principle of proper engineering they had ever learned. She started by reinforcing the external housing of the core assembly. Using a portable arc welder and a roll of carbon fiber mesh from her supplies, she created a secondary containment structure around the damaged section. The mesh was held in place temporarily with adhesive tape, the same silver tape that humans had been using for repairs since their early space age, while she welded support brackets into place. You cannot apply adhesive tape to quantum core housing, Kesval protested. I'm not, Jules said, not looking up from her work. The welding torch cast flickering shadows across her face. I'm applying it to the external housing to hold the mesh in place while I weld. The tape won't be load-bearing in the final configuration. It's just temporary. But the tape was not the most disturbing thing. Jules rerouted power conduits, bypassing damaged sections and creating new pathways using spare cable she had brought from the Lucky Patch. The cable was not Ytharian standard. It was human-manufactured, thicker and cruder. But she made it work by installing adapter couplings that she fabricated on the spot using a portable machine shop she had in one of her duffel bags. She reprogrammed the secondary stabilizers, adjusting their frequency to counteract the harmonic resonance. This required accessing the ship's control systems, and Thel'van had to authorize her access after Kesval confirmed that her approach was theoretically sound, if unorthodox. She installed rubber dampeners, literally pieces of cut rubber matting, between the mounting struts and the deck to absorb vibrations. The dampeners were secured with industrial adhesive, and in places where the adhesive alone was insufficient, with cable ties looped through bolt holes. And then came the most controversial part. I need you to activate the core, Jules said. Every Ytharian in the engineering bay stopped what they were doing. Kesval's face showed an expression that, for his species, indicated profound shock. That would be catastrophic, he said. That would let me see where the stress points are under load, Jules corrected. I can't tune the stabilizers properly without seeing how the system behaves when it's active. Right now I'm guessing. I need data. The risk is enormous, yeah, Jules agreed. But you're all going to die anyway if we don't try this, so we can die sitting here doing nothing, or we can die trying something that might work. Captain's call. Thel'van had been listening from the entrance to the engineering bay. He walked forward now, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He looked at Jules, this short, grease-stained human who had appeared out of nowhere with her crude tools and impossible confidence, and then at Kesval. Activate the core, he said quietly. Minimum power only. Kesval's hands shook slightly as he input the commands. The quantum core, which had been dormant for the past 7 hours, hummed to life. The fracture immediately began to glow with a sickly purple light as energy bled through the damaged matrix. Alarms blared. The fracture extended by half a millimeter in the first 30 seconds. Jules stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the external housing, eyes closed. She was feeling the vibrations, sensing the flow of energy through the structure, reading the ship's pain through her fingertips. "There," she said, pointing to a support strut on the starboard side. "That's your primary resonance point. It's amplifying the stress on the containment field." She grabbed her welding torch and a piece of scrap metal, literally a section cut from a storage container, and did something that made Kesval's professional soul cry out in anguish. She folded the metal into a wedge shape and jammed it into the gap between the strut and its mounting bracket. The resonance stopped. The readout stabilized. "Now bring it up to 40% power," Jules said. "That is extremely dangerous," Kesval protested. "Do it." Thel'van nodded. Kesval, his hand steady now with the resignation of a man who had already accepted the impossible, brought the core up to 40%. The fracture glowed brighter, but it did not extend. The secondary stabilizers, reinforced by Jules's improvised supports and dampeners, held the geometry within acceptable tolerance. The core operated at 40% power for 5 full minutes without cascade failure. Jules nodded, satisfied. "Okay, power it down. We're going to reinforce 2 more stress points, then we can try for full standby power. That'll be enough to get you to the nearest starbase." Kesval powered down the core and stood there for a moment, staring at the readouts. By every principle of engineering he had learned in 43 years, what he had just witnessed should not have been possible. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. Jules shrugged. "Experience, intuition, luck, take your pick." Pause, then added more seriously. "Your people build amazing ships, everything perfect, elegant, integrated, but perfect is brittle. One thing breaks and the whole system fails because everything depends on everything else working exactly right. And human ships, we build them tough and stupid. Lots of redundancy. Over-engineered where it matters, under-engineered where it doesn't. And when something breaks, which it always does, we fix it with whatever we've got on hand and keep going." She went back to work. Kesval watched her for a moment longer, then picked up his tools and started helping. If this mad human's approach was going to save his ship, the least he could do was learn from it. 4 hours later, the Eternity's Edge limped away from its position in neutral space under its own power. The quantum core operated at 60% capacity, enough for sublight maneuvering and basic life support. The nearest starbase, Outpost Meridian, was 4 days away at reduced speed. Jules stayed aboard. She set up a sleeping bag in the corner of the engineering bay and worked in 4-hour shifts, constantly monitoring her repairs, making small adjustments. The fracture was no longer growing. The improvised reinforcements held. The Ytharian crew did not know quite what to make of her. She was gruff, casual, and seemed to treat their immaculate warship like a piece of junk to be patched up. But she was also saving their lives, so they brought her food from the officers' mess and tried to make her comfortable. On the second day, Kesval brought her a cup of tea, Ytharian blend, fragrant and calming, and sat down on the deck beside her sleeping bag. "May I ask you something?" he said. Jules was recalibrating a stabilizer frequency. "Sure. Why do you do this? The salvage work, the repairs. It is clearly dangerous work and I suspect not particularly profitable." Jules was quiet for a moment, making fine adjustments. Then she said, "I was a merchant fleet engineer for 15 years. Worked on big haulers, passenger liners, all the fancy ships. Everything by the book, everything perfect. Then one day I'm on a colony transport that throws a coolant line in deep space. By the book, we're supposed to shut down the reactor and wait for rescue. But we've got 2,000 colonists in cryo, and if the reactor goes down, they die." She finished the adjustment and sat back. "So I fixed it. Jury-rigged a bypass using spare parts from the machine shop, kept the reactor online long enough to reach port, saved 2,000 lives. The review board stripped my certification for unauthorized repairs and safety violations." Kesval made a soft sound of sympathy. "That is unjust." "That's protocol," Jules corrected. "They weren't wrong technically. What I did was dangerous and against regulations, but those colonists lived. So I got into salvage. Out here, there's no review board. There's just problems and solutions. I like it better this way. On the fourth day, Outpost Meridian appeared on their sensors. The station was a major hub, a cylindrical structure 3 kilometers long with docking facilities for everything from personal shuttles to dreadnoughts. As the Eternity's Edge limped toward Docking Bay 7, word had already spread. A Sentinel-class warship with catastrophic quantum core failure should not have been able to reach them under its own power. The fact that it was causing quite a stir. When the station's engineering teams boarded to begin proper repairs, they found the quantum core held together with carbon fiber mesh, adhesive tape, cable ties, rubber dampeners, and what appeared to be a piece of scrap metal jammed into a support strut. The head of station engineering, a Corthan named Vexmesh, stared at the assembly for a full minute without speaking. He began, then stopped. This is a violation of every safety protocol in the Interstellar Maritime Code. Jules, who had been packing her tools, shrugged. It got them here alive. You do not understand, Vexmesh said, his voice rising. This is not merely unorthodox. This is dangerous. If word spreads that such methods are acceptable, it could undermine centuries of established engineering practice. The Maritime Code exists for a reason. The Maritime Code assumes you have time to do things right, Jules countered. These people had 18 hours. I gave them 4 days. You can take it from here. She shouldered her duffel bags and headed for the airlock. Captain Thel'van met her there. The Council has been notified, he said quietly. They wish to speak with you. Jules froze. The Interstellar Maritime Council. Yes, there is to be a hearing. They are concerned about the methods used to repair my ship. I saved your ship. I know, and I have testified to that effect. But the Engineering Guild has lodged a formal complaint. They wish to establish that such repairs cannot be permitted as standard practice. Jules felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had been through this before 8 years ago. The review board, the formal accusations, the systematic destruction of her career for the crime of saving lives in ways that violated regulations. I can't afford a lawyer, she said flatly. The Council will provide representation, but Jules, Thel'van hesitated. I will speak for you. My entire crew will speak for you. We owe you our lives. That didn't help much last time. But she went anyway because refusing a council summons was not really an option. The Interstellar Maritime Council convened on Apex Station, a neutral facility where representatives from 24 civilizations gathered to establish and enforce the laws governing space travel. The hearing chamber was a vast circular room with seating arranged in ascending tiers, like an ancient amphitheater. At the center, alone, sat a single chair for the accused. Jules sat in that chair and looked up at 24 species, Ytharians, Corthans, Draconites, Velosians, and others she didn't recognize, all looking down at her with varying expressions of curiosity, concern, or disapproval. The prosecution was led by High Engineer Sektharn, a distinguished Ytharian with silver patches on his temples that indicated advanced age and high status. He was, ironically, the same species as the crew Jules had saved. But he represented the Engineering Guild, and the Guild's concerns transcended species loyalty. This council is convened, Sektharn began, his voice resonating through the chamber, to address the matter of unauthorized repairs performed on the Ytharian warship Eternity's Edge by the human salvage operator Jules Reeves. The Engineering Guild contends that the methods used, while superficially effective, represent a dangerous precedent that threatens the safety standards we have established over millennia of spacefaring civilization. Holographic displays activated around the chamber, showing images of the quantum core, duct tape, cable ties, rubber dampeners, the improvised wedge jammed into the support strut. Each image was presented with maximum impact, designed to look as crude and dangerous as possible. The quantum containment matrix is the most critical system on any faster-than-light vessel, Sektharn continued. The safety protocols surrounding its maintenance are not arbitrary. They are based on fundamental physics and centuries of accumulated knowledge. To claim that such a system can be repaired with primitive adhesives and scrap metal is not merely unorthodox. It is a repudiation of everything we understand about proper engineering. Expert witnesses were called. Corthan physicist explained why the repairs should not have worked. A Draconite safety inspector testified that the improvised reinforcements created unacceptable risk. One by one, they built a case that Jules's success was luck, not skill, and that allowing such methods to spread could lead to catastrophic failures across the galaxy. Jules sat and listened, her hands folded in her lap. She had heard variations of these arguments before. She understood their perspective. They were not wrong, exactly. What she had done was risky. The fact that it worked did not mean it should be considered acceptable practice. When she was finally given a chance to speak, she stood slowly. She was not a public speaker. She was a mechanic, but she knew how to tell the truth plainly. "I don't know all your theories," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried it clearly. "I know what works. That crew had 18 hours to live. Now they're alive. You're telling me I should have let them die because my methods weren't in your manual." "The issue is not whether they lived," Thel'van replied. "The issue is whether we can permit methods that have not been proven safe through proper testing and certification. Your repairs might have failed at any moment. The crew might have died anyway, and with them would have died any rescue personnel who responded to a second distress call. But they didn't fail. By fortune, not design." "By design," Jules countered. "Maybe not the kind of design you're used to, but design nonetheless. I didn't just throw tape at the problem. I analyzed the stress points, identified the failure modes, and created redundant reinforcements to distribute the load. It wasn't pretty, but it was engineered. With adhesive tape. With whatever materials were available," Jules said, her voice rising slightly. "Look, I get it. You want predictability. You want to know that every repair will work the same way every time. But space doesn't work like that. Space is full of unique problems that don't fit in your manuals. Sometimes you have to improvise." A member of the council, a Velosian with translucent skin and luminous eyes, spoke up. "You claim your methods are engineered, but you cannot produce calculations, simulations, or safety certifications. How are we to trust that your approach is sound?" Jules thought about this. "In human history," she said slowly, "we have a story about a space mission called Apollo 13. It was one of our early attempts to reach our moon. There was an explosion. The ship was crippled. 3 astronauts were going to die in space. The engineers on the ground had to figure out how to keep them alive using only the materials on board the damaged ship. Do you know what they used? Plastic bags, cardboard, and tape. They built a life support adapter from cargo manifest items and instructions transmitted from thousands of miles away. Those astronauts lived." She looked around the chamber. "That's human engineering. We don't always have the perfect solution. We don't always have time to run simulations and get certifications. But we have the absolute refusal to accept impossible. We make do. And sometimes making do is exactly what's needed." The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Thel'van spoke again. "Your passion is admirable, but passion does not override physics. The fact remains that proper engineering requires proper methods." "Then where do new methods come from?" Jules asked. "Someone has to try something different first. Someone has to prove that a new approach works. If you only accept methods that have already been certified, you can never improve. You're stuck." It was at this moment that Captain Thel'van was called to testify. He stood at a witness podium, tall and dignified in his formal uniform, and the council waited for him to condemn the crude repairs that had saved his ship. Instead, he said, "I have been an engineer since before this human was born. I was taught, as all of you were taught, that some things cannot be fixed, that when a quantum core fractures, the ship is lost. I accepted this as fact." He paused, looking directly at Jules. "I watched this human fix the unfixable. Not by knowing more than me. She is not a quantum physicist. She does not have degrees from prestigious academies. She fixed it by thinking differently. She saw possibilities where I saw only failure. She refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. And in doing so, she saved 140 lives, including my own." His voice grew stronger. "Perhaps the engineering guild is correct. Perhaps her methods are too dangerous to permit as standard practice. But I know this. In 43 years as an engineer, I had forgotten how to see a problem as anything other than a checklist of approved solutions. This human reminded me that engineering is not merely about following procedures. It is about solving problems, and sometimes the best solution is one that has never been tried before. The chamber erupted in discussion. Some council members were clearly moved by Thel'van's testimony. Others remained skeptical. The debate might have continued for hours, but then something happened that changed everything. An emergency broadcast interrupted the proceedings. A passenger liner, the Celestial Dream, had suffered a catastrophic failure 3 hours away from Apex Station. A cargo bay door had jammed shut with 60 passengers trapped behind it. The ship's engineers had tried every standard procedure to open it. Nothing worked. Life support in the isolated section would fail in 4 hours. The council chamber went silent. Then every eye turned to Jules. High Engineer Sectharn stood slowly. For a long moment he simply looked at the human sitting in the accused's chair. Then he asked very quietly, "Could you fix it?" Jules was on a fast courier ship within 20 minutes along with Kesval, who had volunteered to assist her. The flight to the Celestial Dream took 90 minutes at maximum acceleration, leaving them less than 3 hours to solve the problem. The liner's chief engineer met them at the airlock. She was a Korthan named Mesvik, and she looked exhausted. "We have tried everything," she said, leading them quickly through the corridors. "The door mechanism is fused. The control systems are completely non-responsive. We attempted to cut through, but the door is reinforced alloy. It would take 6 hours to breach." "Which you don't have," Jules said. "Which we do not have." The jammed door was in a passenger corridor, sealed shut with 60 terrified beings on the other side. Jules could hear them through the metal, the sounds of children crying, adults trying to stay calm. She pressed her hand against the door and felt its solid, immovable presence. "Show me the mechanism specs," she said. Mesvik pulled up schematics on a portable display. Jules studied them for 8 minutes while Kesval took sensor readings. The door was designed to slide open laterally, driven by hydraulic pistons. The pistons had seized when contaminated fluid, likely from the initial failure that caused all of this, had fouled the system. "Can we bypass the hydraulics and open it manually?" Jules asked. "The door weighs 3 tons, Mesvik said. "Even with mechanical assistance, the force required is probably within the range of what we can generate," Jules finished. "We just need the right leverage point." "Kes, what's the structural integrity of the door frame?" Kesval consulted his scanner. "Solid. The frame can handle significantly more stress than the door itself." "Good." Jules turned to Mesvik. "I need a hydraulic jack, the kind used for heavy equipment maintenance. I need a cutting torch. And I need something to use as a lever. A metal pole, a structural beam, anything rigid and at least 3 meters long." The equipment was gathered in 15 minutes. By this time, they had less than 2 hours before life support failed behind the door. Jules studied the door for another 5 minutes, running her hands along the seams, feeling for weak points. Then she marked 3 spots with a piece of chalk. "Cut here, here, and here," she told the engineer with the torch. "Just enough to compromise the structural integrity of these specific points. We're creating failure zones." The cuts took 20 minutes. Then Jules positioned the hydraulic jack at the base of the door and started pumping. The jack was designed to lift mining equipment, capable of generating tremendous force. As pressure built, the door groaned but did not move. "Now the lever," Jules said. She wedged a 3-meter metal beam into the gap created by the jack, using one of the cut points as a fulcrum. Then she called over the 4 strongest crew members on the ship, 2 Draconites and 2 humans. "When I say pull, you pull," she instructed. "All your weight, all your strength. We're going to force this door open through pure mechanical advantage." She positioned herself at the end of the lever. Kesval joined her, even though Ytharians were not particularly strong. The 4 crew members took positions along the beam. "Pull." 6 beings threw their combined strength against the lever. The beam bent slightly under the stress. The door groaned. And then, with a shriek of tortured metal, it moved, just a centimeter, but it moved. Again, pull, another centimeter, another. Jules repositioned the jack, extending it further into the gap. Repositioned the lever. "One more time, everything you've got, pull." The door, subjected to forces and stresses it was never designed to handle, applied at precisely calculated weak points, finally gave up. It slid open half a meter, enough for people to squeeze through. 60 passengers emerged into the corridor, many of them crying, all of them alive. Jules sat down on the deck, breathing hard. Kesval sat beside her. "That was not in any manual," he said. "No," Jules agreed. "It wasn't." They returned to Apex Station to find the council chamber packed. Word had spread about the rescue. When Jules walked back to the central chair, the atmosphere was different. The faces looking down at her showed less judgment, more curiosity. High Engineer Thel'van stood to deliver the verdict. His expression was difficult to read. "The council has deliberated throughout your absence," he said formally. "We have reviewed the evidence, heard testimony, and witnessed the results of your methods both on the Eternity's edge and aboard the Celestial Dream." He paused, and Jules braced herself for the condemnation she had heard before. "We find that Jules Reeves's actions aboard the Eternity's edge were unorthodox, potentially dangerous, and completely against established protocol." Another pause. "They were also necessary, effective, and we now understand, representative of a type of engineering that the galaxy has forgotten." Thel'van looked directly at Jules. "For 12,000 years, the civilizations of this council have refined our engineering practices, eliminating risk through standardization and procedure. We have created ships and systems of extraordinary reliability, but in doing so, we have lost something that this human possesses: the ability to adapt, to improvise, to solve problems that have no standard solution." He gestured to the displays showing her repairs. "These methods will not replace our established practices. They should not be used when proper repairs are possible. But in crisis situations, when standard procedures have failed, when lives hang in the balance, in these moments, adaptive engineering may be not merely acceptable but necessary." The verdict was read. Jules was not sanctioned. More than that, she was offered a position: crisis engineering consultant to the Interstellar Maritime Council. Her role would be to train engineers from across the galaxy in adaptive repair methods, to supplement their formal education with practical crisis management skills. Jules stood there, stunned. She had walked into this chamber expecting to lose everything again. Instead, they were offering her legitimacy, recognition, a purpose beyond scraping together salvage fees in the empty spaces between civilizations. "I'm not a teacher," she said quietly. "You already are," Thel'van replied. "You taught Chief Engineer Kesval. You can teach others." 6 months later, Jules stood in a training facility on Apex Station, looking at a classroom full of engineers from a dozen different species. They sat at workstations equipped with damaged ship components, everything from fractured hull plates to malfunctioning power systems. Each problem had been carefully selected to have no standard solution, no procedure in the manual that would fix it. Kesval stood beside her at the front of the room. He had taken a leave of absence from the Eternity's edge to serve as her assistant instructor. The distinguished Ytharian engineer who 6 months ago had believed that some problems were simply unsolvable, now wore coveralls nearly as stained as Jules's. "Okay," Jules said, addressing the class. "Before we start, I need to make something clear. What I'm going to teach you is not a replacement for proper engineering. It's a supplement, a last resort. When you have time to do things right, do them right. Use the procedures you've learned, follow the safety protocols, run the simulations." She walked along the rows of workstations. "But space is chaos. Equipment fails in unexpected ways. Circumstances arise that nobody planned for. And in those moments when the manual doesn't have an answer and lives are on the line, you need to be able to improvise. That's what we're here to learn." A young Corthan engineer raised a hand. "How do we know when improvisation is appropriate?" "Good question," Jules said. "The answer is, when the alternative is accepting failure, when following procedure means people die, when the proper solution isn't possible in the time you have, that's when you improvise." She held up a roll of duct tape. Several of the students looked at it with barely concealed disdain. "This is probably the most famous piece of human engineering technology in the galaxy now. Do you know why humans have used adhesive tape for repairs for over 300 years? It's not because we're primitive. It's because it works. It's versatile, it's reliable, and it's available. It's a tool. Not the only tool, not always the best tool, but a tool that has saved lives." Kesval stepped forward. I once believed that using such materials was beneath the dignity of proper engineering, he said. I was wrong. The materials do not matter. What matters is understanding the problem deeply enough to know which materials will solve it. Jules did not save my ship with tape. She saved it with analysis, creativity, and the refusal to give up. The first exercise was simple, a cracked pressure seal on a life support conduit. In a proper repair facility, this would require replacing the entire seal assembly, a 3-hour procedure with specialized parts. Jules gave them 20 minutes and a box of miscellaneous supplies. The students struggled. They were used to following procedures, consulting specifications, using the right tool for each job. Now they had to think differently. A Velosian engineer spent 10 minutes trying to fabricate a proper replacement seal before realizing she didn't have the right materials. A Draconite attempted to weld the crack shut and nearly melted the surrounding structure. Jules walked among them, offering guidance. Stop thinking about the right way to fix it. Think about what needs to happen. The seal needs to hold pressure. How can you make that happen with what you have? A human student, one of 3 in the class, was the first to find a solution. He wrapped the cracked section with flexible sealant tape, reinforced it with wire to prevent the tape from bulging under pressure, and then used quickset epoxy to create a rigid outer shell. It wasn't pretty, but when he pressurized the conduit for testing, it held. Good, Jules said. That'll last long enough to get to a repair station. That's all it needs to do. Now explain to the class why you chose that approach. The student walked through his reasoning. The tape provided immediate pressure containment, the wire prevented structural failure, the epoxy added long-term stability. Each component served a specific purpose. It wasn't random, it was engineered improvisation. Over the following weeks, the exercises grew more complex. Malfunctioning navigation systems, damaged power regulators, structural failures. Each problem required analysis, creativity, and the willingness to try unconventional solutions. But Jules also taught them something equally important, knowing when not to improvise. She presented scenarios where attempting a quick fix would be more dangerous than accepting the failure and evacuating. She taught them to recognize the difference between a problem that could be patched and a problem that required proper repair. Human engineering has a saying, she told them. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, but also don't let good enough become an excuse for sloppy work. You need to know the difference. The students came from different cultures, different educational backgrounds, different engineering philosophies. The Ytharians favored elegant solutions, minimal interventions that worked with existing systems. The Corthans preferred robust over-engineering, building in redundancy. The Draconites liked direct approaches, solving problems through force and durability. The humans, of course, were all over the map, some methodical, some chaotic, all stubborn. Jules worked with each of them individually, helping them adapt their natural inclinations to crisis situations. She taught the Ytharians that elegance wasn't always possible. She taught the Corthans that sometimes you didn't have the materials for redundancy. She taught the Draconites that brute force could make problems worse. And she taught the humans, who needed it most, that improvisation required discipline, not just creativity. Kesval proved to be an excellent instructor. His formal education gave him credibility with students who might have dismissed Jules as an untrained maverick. But more than that, his own transformation, from rigid adherent to protocol to adaptive problem solver, showed them that change was possible. I am not a human, he told the class during one lecture. I cannot think exactly as they think, but I can learn from how they approach problems. I can incorporate their flexibility into my methodology without abandoning my training. This is what we are all here to do, expand our capabilities, not replace them. 3 months into the program, the class faced their final examination. Each student was assigned to a different simulation, a ship in crisis, with multiple system failures, limited time, and inadequate resources. The simulations were brutally realistic, incorporating random complications and cascading failures. A Ytharian student named Thel'van was assigned a scenario involving a colony transport with failing life support and a damaged reactor. His first instinct was to shut down the reactor and transfer power to backup systems, the proper procedure. But the simulation showed him that backup power was insufficient for the number of colonists in cryosleep. If he shut down the reactor, people would die. Thel'van stared at the problem for 30 seconds. Then, drawing on everything he had learned, he began improvising. He rerouted cooling systems, bypassed damaged control circuits, and created a jury-rigged containment system using structural reinforcements and emergency repair materials. It wasn't elegant. It violated a dozen safety protocols. But when the simulation ended, all the colonists were alive and the ship had reached safe harbor. He emerged from the simulation pod shaking. "I cannot believe I did that," he said. Jules smiled. "But you did, because you had to, that's the point." Not every student passed. A few could not overcome their training, could not break free from the need to do things properly. Jules failed them without hesitation. "This isn't about participation," she told them. "This is about being able to save lives when everything goes wrong. If you can't do that, you shouldn't be certified for crisis engineering." Those who passed received a certification that was already becoming prestigious in the galactic engineering community. Companies wanted crisis-certified engineers on their crews. Military fleets were requesting them for deployment on long-range missions. The ability to improvise, to adapt, to fix the unfixable, it was becoming recognized as a valuable skill. On the last day of the first training cohort, Jules gathered her students in the classroom one final time. 23 engineers from 11 species, all of them carrying tools they never would have touched 6 months ago. "You came here as specialists," Jules said. "Experts in your fields, trained in the best practices of your civilizations. I haven't made you less expert. I've made you more versatile. You can still do everything you could before. Now you can also do things you never thought possible." She held up a data pad showing news reports from across the galaxy. 3 ships saved in the past month by crisis-certified engineers. A station disaster averted. A rescue mission succeeded against impossible odds. "This is what you're going back to," she said. "Real problems, real lives, real chances to make a difference." A Corthan student raised her hand. "What if we fail? What if we try to improvise and it doesn't work?" "Then you fail," Jules said simply. "That's the risk. But you know what's worse than trying and failing? Not trying at all. Accepting that people will die because the problem doesn't fit in your manual. That's not engineering. That's just giving up." After the ceremony, after the students had dispersed to return to their ships and stations and assignments, Jules stood in the empty classroom. HFY found her there, looking at the workstations where dozens of engineers had learned to think differently. "You should be proud," he said. "You have changed the galaxy's understanding of what is possible." "I just taught them to use duct tape," Jules said. "No," HFY corrected gently. "You taught them hope. You taught them that impossible is not a fact but a challenge. That is a far more valuable lesson than any engineering technique." Jules received a message later that day. It was from Captain Thel'van. The Eternity's Edge had been fully repaired months ago, restored to factory specifications with proper Ytharian components. But in the engineering bay, mounted on a bulkhead like a piece of sacred art, was a small section of silver duct tape preserved behind protective glass. Beneath it, a plaque read, "In memory of the impossible repair and the human who taught us that impossible is just another problem waiting for a solution. May we never forget that the best tool is not always the perfect one. It is the one that saves lives." Jules read the message 3 times. Then she smiled, set down her data pad, and went back to preparing lesson plans for the next cohort of students. There was work to do. There were always more engineers who needed to learn that sometimes the gap between life and death was just a matter of creativity, stubbornness, and a roll of tape. Because that was human engineering, not the belief that humans were smarter or better or more advanced than other species. Just the bone-deep refusal to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. The conviction that there was always a way, if you were willing to think differently and try hard enough and make do with what you had. Sometimes that meant using materials that made other species cringe. Sometimes it meant breaking rules that had stood for millennia. Sometimes it meant looking at a fractured quantum core and saying, "Yeah, I can work with that." But mostly it meant caring enough to try when everyone else had given up. And in a galaxy full of perfect ships and elegant solutions and proper procedures, that turned out to be exactly what was needed. Jules picked up a roll of duct tape from her desk. She kept several on hand now, both for practical use and symbolic value, and turned it over in her hands. 300 years of human spaceflight, countless lives saved. All because someone, somewhere, had looked at a broken thing and refused to accept that broken meant finished. She set the tape down and got back to work. The next class started in 2 weeks, and she had exercises to design. Problems with no standard solutions. Challenges that would require creativity, adaptation, and the kind of stubborn determination that humans had been perfecting since they first looked up at the stars and decided that the impossible was just an invitation to try harder. Outside the station windows, ships came and went. Ytharian cruisers with their elegant curves, Corthan freighters built like flying fortresses, Draconite warships bristling with weapons. Beautiful ships, all of them, perfect examples of their species' engineering philosophies. And somewhere out there, Jules knew there were human ships too, patched and repaired and held together with improvisation and determination. Not as elegant, not as perfect, but still flying, still working, still getting the job done. Just like her, just like everyone, she was training to think beyond the manual, to see possibilities instead of limitations, to understand that the real measure of an engineer was not how well they followed procedures, but how effectively they saved lives when all the procedures had failed. The galaxy was learning, slowly perhaps, but learning, and that, Jules thought, was good enough. For now.